Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Welcome to the Walter Bingham File on the 11th of August 2020, which in the Hebrew calendar is the 21st of Av 5780. Here is an announcement. If the virus permitting, you plan to visit Jerusalem, consider to stay at My Little Home in Jerusalem, a 5-star, strictly kosher, 1-bedroom flat in fashionable Baka with all modern facilities and within walking distance of the old city. New building, first floor, Sleep 4. For further details, email mylittlehomeinjerusalem, one word, @gmail.com. I am Walter Bingham, and it's my pleasure to keep you company for the next hour. Although a lot has happened in Israel, in the US, and to our neighbors in the north, this is a short program. Everyone is commenting on our COVID-19 situation, what hasn't been done, what could have been done better, and the blame game has never been more extensive. So I decided to refrain from detailed comment until I noticed definitive developments. The death toll following the catastrophic explosion in Lebanon's capital city Beirut stands at 160 and is expected to rise, while some 6,000 people have been injured. The world feels with the ordinary people of Beirut, who already suffered from indescribable economic depression as well as a serious level of infection from the COVID-19 virus. Many countries have offered aid, including Israel, who is prepared to open its hospitals to treat the injured, with the assurance that everyone will be returned to Lebanon. Unfortunately, it looks as if Israel's offer will be ignored, because Hezbollah, who is in effective control of Lebanon, would rather tolerate more death than to put aside its anti-Israel policy for the sake of humanity. It's well known that Israel is always one of the first to send aid to flood, to earthquake and other catastrophe-stricken countries, and although Lebanon is enemy territory, Israel will apply humanitarian principles before political considerations. There is, however, a vast difference between that and to confer honor on this enemy state. Hear who did that after the break.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
There is a vast difference between humanitarian principles and to confer honor on this enemy state. The mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldai, seems ignorant of that distinction. By ordering the facade of the Tel Aviv City Hall to be illuminated with the state flag of Lebanon, an official enemy of Israel to this day, he heaps insult on the veterans of the Lebanon War and to the families who have lost dear ones in fighting that enemy. It's not a matter of party politics or of left or right-wing political orientation, but of plain common decency and respect towards those of Israel's population in the north who live daily in fear of possible attack from Lebanon territory. Shame on you, Mayor Huldai. Israel's prestigious legal organization Shurat Hadin has some interesting facts about the Beirut explosion, and I quote here from them. As the Lebanese people struggle to recover from the catastrophic death and destruction wrought by the Beirut explosion, more questions than answers continue to arise. The official story that in 2013 Lebanese port officials impounded a Moldovan-flagged ship bound for Mozambique laden with explosive chemicals does not address other facts which have emerged and must be investigated. Sections of the Beirut port are under the control of the Hezbollah terrorist organization, and Israeli officials have long complained that the Beirut port, the Hezbollah port, was being utilized by the terrorists to smuggle contraband and weapons into Lebanon. As UN Ambassador Danny Danon recently stated, Israel discovered that Iran and its Quds force have been exploiting civilian maritime channels and especially the port of Beirut. Hezbollah has a long history of illegally acquiring and stockpiling ammonium nitrate in civilian areas. In 2015, Britain's MI5 and Metro Police carried out a raid on a secret Hezbollah warehouse in London that contained 3 tons of ammonium nitrate. The British government shamefully covered up the raid in order not to damage relations with Iran shortly after signing the dangerous nuclear deal. It is believed Hezbollah was planning on using the chemicals for an attack in the UK. The same year, police in Cyprus discovered a Hezbollah warehouse storing 8.3 tons of ammonium nitrate. A Hezbollah operative was arrested and charged with planning a terror attack. A state prosecutor said Lebanese-Canadian Hussein Bassam Abdallah admitted that Hezbollah aimed to mount terrorist attacks against Israeli interests in Cyprus using the ammonium nitrate that he had been ordered to guard at the Larnaca home of another official of the Iranian-backed group. Israeli intelligence gave German police information earlier this year of the location of a Hezbollah stockpile of ammonium nitrate in southern Germany. The fact that the Iranian terror group was warehousing the explosives on German soil helped to push Berlin to outlaw all wings of the Hezbollah organization. Mossad reportedly gave Germany information about warehouses in the south of the country where Hezbollah stashed hundreds of kilograms of ammonium nitrate, a material used to make explosives. Hezbollah has a long history and deliberate strategy of stockpiling rockets, weapons and explosives in civilian areas. Hezbollah intentionally utilizes civilian neighborhoods, including the basement of schools, mosques, residential buildings and hospitals, as missile depots. The terrorists understand that the Israeli Air Force would be hindered in responding to rockets launched from civilian centers during the next war with Lebanon. And if Israel does attack the launchers and kills civilians, Hezbollah is counting on the UN, the Europeans and the ICC to immediately accuse Israel of war crimes. Hezbollah calls it his Human Shield Program. In 2016, Hezbollah's chief terrorist Hassan Nasrallah has threatened to fire rockets at an ammonia storage facility in Haifa, and he vowed that the explosion would be like a nuclear bomb striking Israel. He repeated this threat on several occasions, causing Israeli officials to remove the storage tanks. Hezbollah leader Nasser Nasrallah threatened in the past to destroy Israel by causing a massive explosion in the port of Haifa using ammonia tanks that he said would be like a nuclear explosion. In addition, Hezbollah allegedly sought to acquire ammonium nitrate via Syria since 2009 and tried to infiltrate the agriculture ministry in Lebanon to do so, according to leaked diplomatic cables. On Valentine's Day in 2005, a team of Hezbollah terrorists murdered the then Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri with a powerful bomb in Beirut. 21 people were killed in the massive explosion. Hariri was a strong opponent of the Hezbollah group and the regime of Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad that was attempting to control Lebanon. 4 Hezbollah assassins are being tried in absentia by a UN court for the murder. Ironically, after 15 years of stalling, the UN's Special Tribunal for Lebanon, hearing the Hariri case, will deliver its decision on Friday. It's believed the Special Tribunal will declare Hezbollah as responsible for the bombing attack. Hezbollah's long involvement in attempting to procure and stockpile ammonium nitrate perpetuates the growing suspicion that the Iranian terrorist organization which rules Lebanon was directly involved in the warehousing of the chemicals at the Beirut port. When the Lebanese population will finish dealing with the devastation and mourning its dead and wounded, the finger pointing at Hezbollah's role in the tragedy will begin in earnest. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon, whose verdict in the Hariri assassination trial will further emphasize Hezbollah's guilt. Hezbollah and its Iranian masters, the key source of Middle East instability, must be driven out of Lebanon. That was the report by Shurat Hadin. It's just 85 days to the presidential election in the United States of America, and not only the legislature, but also the country is in turmoil. In the American halls of government, the primacy of dialogue no longer exists, but instead every matter that should be discussed becomes a one-sided series of often unsubstantiated accusations with an anti-Trump undertone. Important matters are neglected, and all the proceedings, particularly in the House of Representatives, are directed to try and unseat the president or, at best, prevent his re-election. Hearings in front of the House Judiciary Committee of important politicians alleged to have played a part in the Russian interference in U.S. state matters are treated like props to facilitate a session of monologues by hostile House members with practically no realistic opportunity to reply to the accusations. Because of strict time limits on each House member, they accuse the supposed interviewee, when trying to answer, of stealing their time. It resembles a monotonous reality show rather than a serious legislative inquiry. The Democrat members' apparently only purpose is to demonize the opposition and play to the cameras. No wonder that most people ignore most politicians, because most politicians ignore most people. It is refreshing to follow the exploits of President Trump, whose modus operandi is transparent government by almost daily direct communications with the people. However, he too often falls into the trap of negative comments rather than sticking to positive policy pronouncements. But at least we hear from him, whereas the Democrat Party keep their men mostly under wraps. They are following the advice of Abraham Lincoln, who said, "Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt." There's talk of public debates between Trump and Biden, but until I see Biden on the podium facing the president, I have my doubts. His camp present him as a moderate, although Biden has described himself as becoming the most progressive president ever. That's no surprise, since he has adopted many of the policies put forward by Bernie Sanders and has also been endorsed by the Quartet, the 4 female radical socialist members of the House of Representatives. Whoever is in charge of arranging the debates has not taken into consideration that the first debate is scheduled for well after some states have opened the postal voting. President Trump rightly complained and suggests that it would only be fair for a debate to take place before any votes may be cast. The subject of voting for the forthcoming presidential election has become one of the major subjects in media debates. Because of the coronavirus, there is concern by some voters to have to stand in long lines for a considerable time. An arrangement of postal voting is being suggested by the Democrat Party hierarchy. Hear about the dangerous implications of that after this break.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Siminto from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Siminto, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
2 new shows on Israel News Talk Radio.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Postal voting is being suggested by the Democrat Party hierarchy. Whereas some states have a long tradition and well-proven system of postal voting that produces an honest result, there is concern in many quarters that firstly, the post office is not equipped to handle the millions upon millions of items within such a short time. And secondly, that data of local authorities holding addresses of authorized voters is grossly unreliable and will produce voter fraud. Persons long dead will receive ballot papers, and others who have moved addresses may receive multiple ballots. The absentee voting system has been suggested. That means that prospective voters have to apply for a ballot paper to be sent to them. That would make it possible to check the personal details and also prevent mass mailings. Time is short, the debate continues, and no decision has yet been reached. The possibility of an unrealistic ballot looms. Will President Trump accept a Biden win considering that massive voter fraud, particularly in Democrat-controlled states that voted for Trump in 2016, is possible. When asked, Trump said, "It depends, I can't say at this point." So here I leave that subject, except to say that today's silent majority will, under Biden, Sanders and Quartet administration, become an oppressed, controlled and frightened majority. The Israel-Palestinian-Arab conflict was not the only one that often erupted into violence during the late 20th century. Our conflict, although by many thought to be a religious one, is based on territory and not religion. However, religion has been the source of trouble through the ages, and the long-running violence in Northern Ireland was a case in point. The Protestant majority wants to remain with the United Kingdom, while the Catholic population claimed that the 5 counties of Northern Ireland are a natural part of the larger area of the Isle of Ireland, the Catholic Republic of Ireland. A natural recipe for strife that cost much bloodshed. Successive politicians of both sides tried and failed. This week, Britain and Ireland mourned the death of John Hume, the politician who brought peace to Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair said of him, "He was a visionary who did not believe that the present needs to be like the past." It's impossible to overstate the influence John Hume had on peace in Northern Ireland. He is the only person who has received all 3 peace prizes, and justifiably so: the Nobel Peace Prize, the Martin Luther King Prize Award, and the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Prize, and many more awards. I tell you all this to show that with goodwill, peace can be achieved. But is it possible to convince the Palestinian Arabs that it is better to live for one's ideals than to die for them? I doubt it, since martyrdom seems to be a doctrine of Islam. Once upon a time, we liked the goods that were made in China because it meant that they were cheap and value for money. Everywhere you looked, you saw the label "Made in China." The Hebrew word for China is sin. One can still see it everywhere here. Souvenirs from Israel, whether Christian or Jewish, were made in China. How the world has changed. Led by the Trump administration, it was realized that there was a great imbalance in trade, practically a one-way traffic. And not only that, China was heavily investing in America and Europe, undercutting quotations for major infrastructure projects, not only in the US, but Britain and even Israel. China changed from a local manufacturing base to a major shareholder in high-value enterprises. There is much cooperation between our 2 countries that places Israel between a rock and a hard place. Our trade with China causes problems with the United States, who, after all, are our greatest ally. And on the other hand, if we concede to the American request and phase out trade with China, who is fast becoming a world power, our relations with Beijing will have serious economic consequences. At the moment, China has the monopoly on G5, the 5th generation of networking technology, that will revolutionize our lives. Everything will be faster and safer. Not only has President Trump cut trade with China and also hopes that the US will catch up with G5, he has also brought pressure to bear on the UK to cancel their order for G5, I guess in the hope that America can get the business. Israel will subsidize whatever company is engaging in G5 research. One of the claims is that China, through its electronic devices marketed in the world, has the ability to spy on everybody's private life. They can covertly access mobile phone networks through back doors, which allow them to spy on governments. That has been brought to the fore with TikTok, an application directed mainly at children with entertainment games, puzzles and videos. At the moment, the US giant Microsoft is in negotiations to acquire this app and, as I understand it, make it safe. Whether that is possible is a matter for the experts. We all know that politics is a dirty game. It's influenced proceedings since the beginning of time, whether it's in the international relations or within families, and sometimes it even leads to assassinations. Cain killed Abel because he was jealous of Abel's prestige. In Psalm 109 verse 8 we read, "May his days be few, may another take his position." In our time, it's business, markets and power that dictate politics, and assassinations are not uncommon. Leaders don't realize that words they utter are interpreted by their followers in one way and quite differently by their foes. Either way, they are often taken as incitement. Masses are aroused and then used as tools to achieve the leader's aims. That generates the blame game, which ignites the embers of hate and leads to self-perpetuating violence for violence sake. Unlike in years gone by, when politics did not separate people's social life, today the political divide has become a barrier to social interaction. It has become urban guerrilla warfare. The riots in Portland, Oregon and Seattle, where the killing of George Floyd is long forgotten, are examples. Just over this very weekend, stores in Chicago's most fashionable street were looted, several people shot, and 3 were killed. There is no apparent reason other than perhaps the long lingering shock of the Trump victory in 2016. If that's in their mind, it will be unthinkable what the mob would do when on November the 3rd President Trump will be awarded a second term. The slogan Black Lives Matter, that was a cri de coeur after the Floyd murder, has been stolen from genuine mourners as a rallying slogan by the radical extremists. The BLM concept existed long before, otherwise there would still be slavery and institutional segregation. In Israel, the Black Flag protesters who nightly congregate in the vicinity of the Prime Minister's residence profess to act in the cause of democracy, yet their methods of attacking police and night after night disturbing the peace without consideration for the residents in the area are those of mindless louts and not defenders of democracy. Democracy is indeed the power of the people, but expressed in orderly elections and not mindless hooliganism. Another topical example of dirty politics is shown in a short article by Gil Hoffman in the Jerusalem Post, where he writes, and I quote, "Modi'in Mayor Chaim Bibas vigorously denied reports that he intends to form a socio-economic party ahead of the next election to take votes of centrists who do not like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and then help him to form a coalition." The reports in Haaretz and Yediot Achronot said the goal of the party would be to woo voters who cast ballots for blue and white in the past 3 elections, and it would be modelled after the socio-economic Kulanu party, which won 10 seats in 2015. The party attracted support of anti-Netanyahu voters, but then joined the Netanyahu-led government. Yediot called it a straw party and quoted a source in Likud saying Netanyahu intends to use Bibas to obtain a majority in the Knesset because he cannot rely on the current parties in the center-right bloc. The article continues with Biba's denial of these allegations and that he will remain a member of Likud. Bibas is close to Netanyahu and served as his campaign chairman. I've always learned that in politics a strong denial is confirmation of it being true. If Biba's plan is true, then it is akin to defrauding the voter by putting forward one policy with the intention of abandoning it after the election. Stay tuned for another example of what appears to be outrageously dirty politics.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
We live in the age of information, but not inspiration. If you're like me, you're looking to be inspired to reach higher, to connect more, and to grow. Well, if you want to get warm, you need to stand close to the fire. And if you want to catch fire, you need to stand close enough to get hit by the sparks. Join me, Penina Taylor, as we walk with people who have embarked on a spiritual journey towards Torah. We'll uncover what started them on their journey and what truths they discovered along the way. So prepare to be inspired as we take a leap of faith every Sunday at 5 p.m. on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
More dirty politics. Why were the border crossings from the Palestinian Authority area into Israel suddenly and unexpectedly opened at the weekend, so that thousands of Arabs would cross and flock to the beaches of a number of our cities, including Tiberias, Haifa, Netanya, and Tel Aviv, and more? It looks very much as a trick to bolster the economy because they also frequented the restaurants and other establishments. Buses were waiting for them on the Israeli side to transport them to the different destinations at fixed rates. It is inconceivable why security was totally abandoned when normally permits are required to cross into Israel proper with facial recognition gates. I wonder how many terrorists have slipped into Israel and are hiding with Israeli Arab sympathizers. The health consideration seems to have been forgotten totally in favor of commerce. Why are our borders closed except for Palestinian Arabs? Can they not also be carriers of the virus? The result of that irresponsible exercise will soon be apparent. It reeks of a Netanyahu arbitrary decision because I cannot believe that the Corona Tsar, Dr. Gamzu, would have sanctioned this. On the other hand, perhaps he would, when, after all, he sanctioned 16,000 yeshiva students to enter from the United States without many problems. It's no longer dirty politics. It's a filthy, self-promoting, immoral attitude of me first, then everybody else. In the Israeli democracy, there are three branches of government. The executive, comprised of the Prime Minister and his cabinet, the quasi-elected legislature, which are members of parliament, in Israel it's the Knesset, and the judiciary, headed by the High Court of Justice. Each has its separate task. Very simplified, the legislature decides on the laws, the executive, through its ministries, facilitates the practical arrangements, and the judiciary ensures that the laws are adhered to. In a very simplified example, the Knesset decides on the minimum age to drive a car, the Ministry of Transport issues the licenses, and offenders are dealt with by the courts. Unfortunately, in Israel, this division of tasks has become successively blurred. The unelected, self-appointed members of the High Court are in many cases exceeding their powers and infringing upon the task of the government. The IDF, Israel's defense forces, fall under the jurisdiction of the government and as such are one of its branches. In the case of Arab terrorism resulting in murder, the courts decide the punishment of the perpetrator, but the government, through the IDF, can decide on measures to try and prevent further attacks. In the case of the terrorist murder of soldier Amit Ben Yigal, the IDF decided to demolish the home of the perpetrator, Nizmi Abu Bakr, to act as deterrent. The family appealed and the High Court halted the demolition by a vote of 2-1 on grounds that it would punish his wife and children who were not aware of his intention. The High Court seems more a hindrance than a help to the prevention of terrorism. Firstly, and arguably, they are overstepping their brief, but even if that were not the case, how can they determine that the family was ignorant of the husband's intention and that they would be innocently hurt? Were they a fly on the wall? Since when is a one-sided statement acceptable? What about the life of the victim? And what about the hurt to Amit's family? Abu Bakr can be visited in prison, but the Ben Yigal family will never see Amit again. The purpose of the home demolition is not, as the court argued, aimed to punish the terrorist's wife and children, but as a deterrent to would-be terrorists that by their action they may severely hurt their own families. Not being a Twitter follower myself, I learned that Prime Minister Netanyahu wrote on Twitter, "This is an unfortunate decision by the High Court that refused our requests to demolish the house of the terrorist who murdered the late IDF soldier Amit Ben Yigal, who was the only son of his parents. I demand," writes the Prime Minister, "to establish proceedings with an expanded panel of judges. Terrorism must not be allowed to prevail. My policy as Prime Minister is to destroy the homes of terrorists, and I intend to continue to do so." It's not surprising that there is a strong movement in Israel to curb the overriding power of the country's High Court. Coalition governments have their advantage in that many views are being heard, but the disadvantages far outweigh that. Bills introduced by one faction are invariably objected to by another. So it becomes difficult to introduce legislation and hence conduct effective government. That's why it seems impossible to clip the wings of the High Court. The time has already begun when the countries who believe that they contribute to the economy of the Palestinian Authority area realize that they are in fact paying the wages for murder of Jews, and funds will dry up. That too may then help to deter terrorist murders of Jews. One of the hardest dilemmas facing the government are the pros and cons of opening the schools. Some parents argue that corona infection inadvertently brought into the classroom will spread into the homes of students, even if they themselves show no symptoms. Another objection lists the severe shortage of teachers brought about by the introduction of much reduced student numbers per class, and that the answer is home education. Of course, that sounds good in theory, but not all parents are up to this task, particularly when several children of different ages are involved. The government is concerned with stimulating the economy, and home education would prevent the parents from returning to their jobs. Of course, many companies will continue to have their employees doing the work from home, and so considerably reduce the costs of overheads for office space. But not all work can be done from home. So the government has decided to open the schools with different regulations for various grades. It's not only the gap in education that is of concern, but also the psychological effect on students by missing the social interaction with their peers and outdoor activities, which are an integral part of children. If you are a parent of school-aged children, please write to Walter at israelnewstalkradio.com with your views on this important subject. I may even read out your comments on a future program. Here's a story to make you chuckle. Young Daniel had just passed his driving test. He asked his father, who was a rabbi, if they could discuss his use of the family car. His father took him into his study and said, "I'll make a deal with you. Bring your grades up, study the Torah more, and get a haircut. Then we'll talk about it." After about a month, Daniel came back again into the study to ask his father if they could now discuss his use of the car. His father said, "Young man, I am very proud of you. You have improved your grades. You have studied Torah more diligently, but you didn't get your hair cut." Daniel waited a moment, and then he said, "You know, Dad, I've been thinking about that. And it occurred to me that King David had long hair. Samson had long hair. Noah had long hair. And even Moses had long hair." The rabbi replied, "Yes. And everywhere they went, they walked." And that's the end. Until the next program. Breaking news. It is with deep sorrow that I learned of the passing of a giant, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Don't miss next week's program, which will be almost exclusively devoted to the greatest Torah scholar of our lifetime. I am Walter Bingham, hoping you will keep safe from the coronavirus. I don't want to lecture you, but it is absolutely necessary that you adopt at least one elderly in your neighborhood. Although I am extremely fortunate to be fit and agile, but due to my advanced age, I am also mainly housebound and regrettably not able to bring you face-to-face interviews. I also know what it means to rely on others to get some milk or bread. So please understand my weekly plea to look after your elderly neighbors. Goodbye.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom,
Okay, wait a minute.
Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.